Welcome to the Mediterranean Displacements Project 2020 Lecture Series. This is Gary D. Farney, Associate Professor of History at Rutgers, Newark, along with my colleagues Maite Green-Mercado and Brian Murphy, also from Rutgers, Newark. I am a co-founder of the Mediterranean Displacements Project with Professors Green-Mercado and Professor Murphy. On December 2nd, 2020, we welcomed Joseph Viscomi of University of London, Birkbeck, who spoke on Decolonizing Community, Extraterritoriality, Historical Time, and the Departure of Italians from Egypt. His talk was virtual, and it was followed by questions. The entire following video is 1 hour and 20 minutes long.
Welcome everybody to this event for the Mediterranean Displacement Seminar. Our guest today is Joseph Viscomi, who is a historian of the modern Mediterranean. He's a faculty member in the Department of History, Classics, and Archaeology at Birkbeck University of London. He has held a fellowship at NYU Center for European and Mediterranean Studies. He did that after completing a PhD in anthropology and history at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. Joseph's work is on the departure of Italians from Egypt during the mid-20th century. And it's going to be the basis for his book examining political community formation between the 1930s and 1960s. Joseph is also an affiliated researcher with the European Research Council project called Cross Locations, Rethinking Relative Location in the Mediterranean, and that's based at the University of Helsinki. Let me just turn it right over to Joseph. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Brian, and thank you all for inviting me to give this talk today. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so you can see the slides, and I'll get going so that there's plenty of time for discussion afterwards. So this evening I begin with, today I begin with the claim that the category of community has been taken for granted in modern migration history. Communities appear as either ethno-linguistic containers or as imagined or invented abstractions. Today, I would like to suggest that a more critical analysis of community formation in and through historical time can help us rethink central categories through which we interpret historical processes, among them foundational categories such as region and decolonization. So to do so, I'll make two key kind of propositions. First, that our focus on territoriality has limited our understanding of the consequences of migration and mobility. And second, that our approach to temporality has been and continues to be overdetermined by teleological frameworks. In addressing these themes, I hope to present a more dynamic sense of how community takes shape in the modern Mediterranean. But first, a story. In June 1946, the deposed Italian king Vittorio Emanuele III left Italy. He arrived in Egypt, where he benefited from a long exchange between the Casa Savoia and the Egyptian royal family. Fuad, the father of then King Farouk, had studied in Torino, and as a symbol of his indebtedness to Italy, his government had made substantial donations to Italy after the 1908 Messina earthquake, an event which itself had displaced many Sicilians to Egypt. King Farouk kept a coterie of elite Italians amongst his closest acquaintances, irritating British colonial authorities during the 1930s and into the Second World War. In Alexandria, Vittorio Emanuele III was welcomed by around 30,000 Italian subjects who held strongly to this transnational affinity. They were a generation who had lived through the consolidation of the larger Italian community in Egypt, numbering around 55 to 60,000 residents during the 20 years of fascist rule, when a central premise of fascist propaganda emphasized that Italians abroad were a fundamental asset for the expansion of national prestige. Italians in Egypt at the margins of empire figured prominently in this discourse. In 1946, much of the community remained loyal to the king. He was, in a sense, recognized in his exile, both by King Farouk and by the Italian residents in Alexandria and at large in Egypt. He lived quietly in Alexandria until his death on the last day of 1947, when flags at the Italian legation in Cairo and the consulate in Alexandria were flown at half-staff, and King Farouk provided a full military funeral. His body was entombed in St. Catherine's Church, a center of Italian life in Alexandria, and remained there until December 2017, when it was transferred to northern Italy. When Vittorio Emanuele III arrived in Egypt in 1946, diplomatic ties between Italy and Egypt had been ruptured since June 1940, since the Italian entry into the Second World War. During the war, Anglo-Egyptian authorities had imprisoned over 5,000 Italian men and select women in the desert alongside the Suez Canal. Freedom of movement had been restricted for all Italians, their bank accounts were frozen, and other foreign and Egyptian subjects were forbidden from signing contracts with them. Diplomatic ties wouldn't be fully reestablished until 1951. Here you see some images of the internment camps. An article appeared in the Italian newspaper Il Giornale della Sera following the king's arrival in 1946 and condemning the new government in Rome for showing, quote, disinterest in the community of Italian immigrants in Egypt. The article's author noted, quote, it is as though the Italians of Egypt are stateless, even more so than the beneficiaries of the Nansen passport, reserved for those without nationality and protected by international conventions, end quote. The article's author pointed to the complexity of this historical conjuncture, which left a population of immigrants locked between the collapse of the fascist empire in and beyond the Mediterranean and Egypt's decolonization. The king's arrival and reception in Egypt begins to peel away several layers of the socio-historical processes involved in this story. His recognition amongst Italians in Egypt, or gli Italiani d'Egitto as they were known since the 19th century, the narrative of Italian immigrants having been, quote, abandoned by the new Italian state, and the general confusion around the status of Italians in Egypt were all indicative of a complex entanglement, which I aim to unravel today. So this talk is mainly divided into two parts. First, I'll talk about, I'll walk through kind of the central historiographical and methodological questions that structure this project. And then I'll look at one post-war moment to suggest how this approach works out, So returning to the category of community, I contend that communities like Italians in Egypt emerged through multiple and layered historical processes. That is, through encounters between geopolitical maneuvers of state actors played out on a wider scale, and through the micro-interactions of immigrant subjects with these state institutions. Rather than see kind of top-down or bottom-up processes here, I aim to look at the permeation of scales of historical action to understand how different trajectories constitute the very conditions for a community. Here, I seek to break down some of the categories into which we have placed actors in the history of the colonial Mediterranean, as Barota and Jekas call this late 19th and early 20th century conjuncture. A quick note here on the use of community as a more expansive way to understand different and often interchanged terminologies of comunità, collettività, and colonia, not just as a term employed by the state, but also a term through which Italian subjects articulated various claims. It was at this very nexus between these two engagements with the ideas about community that I began to see dynamics of community formation playing out over the course of the 20th century. Reflecting broader historiographies, scholarship on colonial communities in Egypt tends to overlook community formation and to overlook the processual aspect. In part, this is due to the intensely kind of mixed or cosmopolitan environments of Eastern Mediterranean port cities. It portrays communities instead as nationally structured, that is signified through citizenship or origin, yet mercurial entities within the multilingual and pluralistic encounters of Egypt's colonial cities. Building upon a logic inherent to cultural history and postmodern thought, this historiography often depicts communities, these colonial communities, as constructed solely retrospectively or nostalgically after or through their departures, and as materially detached from the political realities that constituted their colonial landscapes. This requires a fairly strict conceptual division. Work on diaspora, for example, separates past and present into distinct or discrete units. As one of the few scholars who has examined the Italian communities in Egypt, Anthony Gorman, he situates the Italians in Egypt as removed from Italy and as truly, quote, in Egypt. He calls them Egyptian Italians, which is already a twist in meaning that neglects important historical trajectories. He frames their, quote, identity as one formed in exile, in other words, as separated from its origins, and then displaced yet again into a second diaspora. This breaks history into discrete periods of experience. We could look at them as home, migrant community in Egypt, second diaspora, if we wanted to break down those discrete periods, which are all founded upon territorial containers and spatial separations. Now, the scholarship on nostalgia is valuable and suggestive, but I think it needs to be kind of wrested from the territorial and temporal categories to which it is often attached, and I'll come back to this a little bit later. Indeed, much of the scholarship on migration and displacement in the colonial and post-colonial Mediterranean understands these individuals or communities as constituted by profoundly detached migrants, omitting the dynamics of emigration and immigration, a movement that at once recognizes the pervasiveness of the state, among other factors, but also seeks to work against the grain of teleological reification. I argue that these approaches flatten dynamics of national identification and cosmopolitanism. And these kind of flattened concepts then conceal asymmetries within and between communities. And more importantly, they obscure the transnational or transregional processes through which communities, in fact, emerge. Perhaps one exception to this are the studies of the Pied Noir, who are often seen as the kind of exceptional par excellence. They're viewed in this way because of their communal category, wholly emerges from the displacement caused by the Algerian War and decolonization, and in many ways appears detached from national histories. That is, it doesn't incorporate historical references from the past, or when it does, it has been argued, it does so retrospectively, always after the fact. In this sense, then, the historiography of the Pied Noir reproduces national categories as dominant frames for subjecthood, French, Algerian, or an idealized Malta, as described by the work of Andrea Smith. And the failure to integrate leads then to the formation of a kind of minor or alternate category, which is that of the Pied Noir. Although sharing in certain post-war experiences with the Pied Noir and overlapping with them sometimes in physical space, Italian departures from Egypt don't fit easily within those frames, precisely because of their placement in and displacement from Egypt evokes narratives of continuity and rupture. There's a lot more engagement kind of with a very specific historical narrative. Indeed, when the deposed Vittorio Emanuele III arrived in Egypt, he was recognized for what he represented in the lives of Italian immigrants living there, despite that his very arrival was premised on the collapse of those very worlds. Nancy Green argues that migration history since the transnational turn tends to generate notions of, quote, unfettered movement across borders. This, in turn, elides the many frictions encountered by mobile subjects, such as what she calls the, quote, stubborn state, as migrants negotiate their surroundings. It also inadvertently reproduces analytical categories. We can think, for example, here about the long debates on methodological nationalism. Now, ironically, the state's absence from this scholarship ends up flattening our knowledge about mobility, particularly in the modern and contemporary period. Now, Nancy Green proposes instead that we concentrate on two key aspects. First, how states have conceived of their subjects who live elsewhere, and second, how mobile subjects use or employ their citizenship. Her approach can help us rethink relations between states, subjects, and citizens especially considering that much of the historiography of migration in the modern period assumes a natural progression from subject to citizen. By paying attention to the micro interactions then of subjects, state institutions, and state actors, we can see how multiple forms of subjecthood coexist, compete, and shape the realities in which political communities form, act, and move. This multiplicity becomes clear, I argue, by expanding our temporal perspective. For example, by considering how the anticipated, actual, and remembered departures of Italian residents from Egypt inflected their experience of the collapse of the fascist empire, of Egypt's decolonization, and then of post-war Italy. Within these changing contexts, Italian residents made decisions and articulated subjecthood and citizenship in ways informed and constrained by unfolding events that conditioned possible outcomes. They did so often in dialogue with institutions directly linked to the Italian state, schools and consulates, just to name two of them, and indirectly linked to the state, newspapers and charity organizations or welfare organizations. By carefully examining these interactions, we can see how colonial and post-colonial communities were homogenized through their departures and how they are differentiated both within and from other communities. So the two key knots that I set out to unravel here, one, territoriality, and two, temporality, are central to this approach. Most of the scholarship on decolonization has taken territoriality or territory for granted. In one of the few works on the displacement of European colonial communities, Fred Cooper sees Europe's, quote, invisible migrants as being quintessential post-colonial peoples. His framework employs decolonization as a tool for a periodization which separates history into before and after and divides territories into conceptual spaces. This is likewise the case in the work of many scholars of Italian post-coloniality, who focus primarily on the consequences of the loss of Italian colonial possessions after the Second World War. So to unsettle these teleologies, first, I argue that the afterlives of extraterritorial legal regimes are crucial to community formation in this particular corridor of the Mediterranean. Second, I argue that in order to see the mechanisms behind these processes, we should shift our focus away from spatialized frameworks to develop a more sophisticated hermeneutics around the temporality of historical experience. Sorry. The capitulations were bilateral treaties between the Ottoman Porte and European powers, signed between the 16th and 19th centuries, with some earlier precedents. They fashioned enclaves of extraterritorial jurisdiction and established residency rights for non-Ottoman subjects. Although their initial purpose was to create zones of protection for merchants and encourage commercial exchange in Ottoman territories, with the rise of the nation state, they served as a legal backdrop for increasingly articulated relations between national subjects and their respective consulates. Throughout much of the Mediterranean, the safeguards tendered by these treaties had been either adapted to colonial administrations or canceled altogether. For example, at the establishment of the French Protectorate in Tunisia in 1881, or upon Italian occupation of Libya in 1911, and through the Treaty of Lausanne in Turkey in 1923. In Egypt, they remained in effect, however, until 1937, when they were formally abolished through a 12-year transition period that would eventually lead to national sovereignty. They had been a major point of contention among Egyptian nationalists who, despite long efforts to cancel the benefits that were included in these treaties, such as tax exemptions of foreign subjects, also feared British attempts to appropriate the financial domination of foreign communities. This is something that happened with the abolition of the capitulations, with the French established the Protectorate in Tunisia in 1881. The implications of the end of the capitulations in Egypt, anticipated lived and remembered effects, have remained largely unstudied. We know how foreign subjects lived in 19th century Egypt, thanks to the work of Will Hanley, and we know how they died in 19th century Egypt, thanks to the work of Shanna Malkin. Yet extraterritorial jurisdiction, although examined from the synchronic perspective of cultural, legal, and political histories of the 18th and 19th centuries, has not been a subject or has not been considered for its role in shaping conditions of possibility for communities and national subjects into the 20th century. We do know that the reconfiguration of legal regimes in the context of migrant subjects in particular can generate new horizons of subjecthood and regional belonging. Mary Dewhurst Lewis, for example, has suggested that the cancellation of extraterritorial privilege and the creation of the French protectorate in Tunisia fostered a kind of proto-European socio-legal category, which itself preceded Europe's existence as a legal entity. In Egypt, the capitulations were abolished only in 1937 at a conference set by the Anglo-Egyptian Treaty 1 year earlier in 1936, a treaty that itself had been precipitated by tensions brought about by Italy's imperial ambitions in the Eastern Mediterranean and in East Africa. Only after the capitulations, wrote a prominent Italian consular lawyer in 1936, would the Italian residents in Alexandria, quote, truly be in Egypt. So again, you see why I have this problem with a territorial framework here. Indeed, by noting the particular character of the Italian immigrants in Egypt, subject to controls and surveillance of the Italian fascist regime and implicated in its imperial horizons, Antonio Gramsci anticipated that the abolishment of the capitulatory privileges would lead to what he called, quote, the denationalization of emigration, end quote. So the imminent end of extraterritorial jurisdiction really reconfigured possibilities for belonging for Italians in Egypt. The decisions they would make within this changing landscape, drawing upon past, presents, and futures, resist easy categorization and reveal at the same time continuities and ruptures. And I believe these are suggestive of kind of micro-historical processes of community formation among migrants at large. So here, the second or methodological knot is central, and that is to unravel this conjuncture. I look towards temporality in historical process or historical time. Rather than focus on the interwar tensions that anticipated that and disentangling, which I've written about elsewhere, today I would like to concentrate on the end of the capitular regime, which occurred in concert with the collapse of the fascist regime and the reconfiguration of geopolitical Mediterranean relations. And I'd like to do this from the perspective of Italian residents in Egypt and political actors around them. The claim that Italian immigrants in Egypt were like stateless subjects at the time of the deposed king's arrival embodies this complex temporality. And reaching beyond the kind of descriptive or teleological chronologies of history and the categories into which we place our subjects, the tensions and harmonies between experience and expectation, the two lenses isolated by historian Reinhard Koselleck, comprise engines for the unfolding of historical time. The quote, conditions of possible events, in other words, the historical processes and structures that transcend particular events, shape this narrative. In other words, you could think about this as kind of a turn to focusing on process rather than event. For that reason, in the second part of this talk, I pay attention to moments of tension between experience and expectation as they surface in documents from the post-war years. I will focus on what cultivated, in the words of one Italian diplomat in Egypt, quote, a sense of chronic uncertainty, end quote. It's this tension that I contend opens up a space to understand the temporal dimensionality of historical time and allows us to see the emergence of a political community in the ruptures and continuities of mid-20th century Mediterranean worlds. So, throughout the fascist consolidation of political and cultural institutions in the 1930s and the period of isolation during the internment, which I briefly discussed above, past and present together created a political horizon for Italian residents in Egypt that had vanished altogether by 1946, and that continued to shape anticipated and eventual departures. I should pause for a moment here on the Second World War. On the cusp of the war, British authorities perceived the consensus among Italian subjects in interwar Egypt as signifying a potential fifth column threat. The capitulations had meant that the Italian government in Rome could fully extend itself over its subjects in Egypt, with only minor interference from British or Egyptian authorities. During the 1935 Ethiopia campaign, British authorities devised a plan to arrest and imprison nearly 12,000 Italian subjects, around 1/5 of the entire community. The initial plan, however, was never put into action, but in June 1940, Anglo-Egyptian authorities arrested and interned around 5,000 individuals, mostly men, and sent them to live in a camp in the eastern desert. Visits were strictly limited, and for those outside the camps, freedom of movement was restricted, signing of contracts rendered illegal, and all Italian institutions were officially closed. Because Italian diplomats had been repatriated, residents were cut off from the various state institutions, schools, consulates, and cultural clubs, which had been fundamental to their interwar social worlds. So here I have two images. These images that were drawn by prisoners at the beginning of their internment, the one on the left, where they were pregnant with optimism. You see the chick hatching from an egg painted in the camp landscape. And then after 3 years, when the isolation had profoundly affected the community, here you see the chick having grown into a kind of maddened chicken with these very anglicized figures looking at it, each one of which is written 1940, 1941, 1942, and 1943. I'm not sure how clear those numbers are. After the Second World War, just at the time the Italian king reached Alexandria, it quickly became apparent how little post-war Egypt and the larger theater of the post-war Mediterranean resembled its former incarnation. As early as 1944, the Italian government, temporarily based in Salerno, expressed apprehension over the situation in Egypt. Prostitution and poverty were rumored to be widespread. Most of the wage-earning men had been imprisoned during the war, and many women had turned to regulated and unregulated sex work to support the meager support they received from the Swiss legation. Italian funds had been blocked entirely by the diplomatic rupture. Freedom of movement had been restored in 1946, but juridical rights and financial accounts remained frozen. A delegate from the Holy See described, quote, Italian residents live in complete destitution. In the Italian colony, poverty has provoked a flooding of moral degradation and prostitution, end quote. He reported around 500 cases of requests for marriage annulments among former internees in the months after release, and also reported that many individuals refused to make confession in church because they were worried about the implications of what had happened during the war. Now, the implications of the community's declining conditions went far beyond the personal. They generated an array of geopolitical questions for the Italian state. Without diplomatic ties, it was difficult for then Secretary General of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Renato Prunas, to intervene on behalf of Italian subjects. Several requests to send a delegation to reconnect with the Italians in Egypt went unanswered by Egyptian authorities. The Egyptian government showed little concern for the predicament of Italians. They were keen instead to continue their struggle for full national sovereignty from British colonial administration. In 1945, Prunas finally obtained permission to send a small delegation to Egypt with the scope of reconnecting the Italian government with the community there. No attempts, however, were to be made to reestablish diplomatic ties. The inconclusive visit provoked anger among some residents. One group collectively signed a letter stapled to a newspaper clipping that showed the Italian diplomat's photo, and they wrote, quote, while your representatives enjoy their trip in Egypt between banquets and orgies and theaters, here, for 6 years now, we sequestered Italians suffer la miseria, the misery and hunger, and all of this to maintain our Italian citizenship, end quote. Nearly all reports reaching Rome mention the reluctance of Italian residents to break from the political structures of fascism, a theme that would endure well into the late 1950s. Indeed, many Italian residents attributed the collapse of Italy's empire to the cowardliness of metropolitan Italians and the sabotage of anti-fascists. One Italian, on a break from naval services with the Allied forces, visited his family in Egypt, where he observed, quote, great contempt by the entire colony, which classified me as a traitor to the patria and a mercenary of the English, end quote. A visit from the Italian Red Cross found that the constant change of names and leadership of small anti-fascist groups had caused many Italian subjects to find them ineffective and irrelevant. I should briefly state also that anti-fascist groups were very few in Egypt. At the most, there were about 100 individuals that were isolated by the Italian regime, and fewer than that by the British regime, by the British administration as potential interlocutors. And in part, this is because of the control and surveillance that which was noted by Gramsci that the Fascist Party had over national subjects and institutions during the 1930s. A very control which had been enabled by the extraterritorial regime created by the capitulations. So the government in Rome was alarmed by the fracture between experience and expectation among Italians in Egypt. One diplomat described the once, quote, vibrant community with its cultural institutions, schools, hospitals, and the main daily newspaper, Il Giornale d'Oriente, and noted that, quote, to this recent past, passato prossimo, corresponds a miserable present, end quote. Institutions and schools remained closed. The hospitals were occupied by Anglo-Egyptian forces. Il Giornale, the famous newspaper, had been shut down since 1940 and replaced with a short publication that had been boycotted by most Italian residents because its editorship was overseen by anti-fascists. Nothing of the present resembled this recent past. A detachment that was multiplied within these encounters between political actors and the institutions and individuals that constituted the community of Italians in Egypt. Another diplomat observed that, quote, that with the loss of Italy's imperial project and the demise of Mediterranean colonialism facing the community, it was natural for Italians to, quote, remember the abandonment and neglect of pre-fascist governments, end quote, and to look favorably upon the fascist party, which had, quote, cultivated the community at the margins of empire. A refusal to listen to other sources, including the boycott of the anti-fascist publications, meant that many individuals remained completely in the dark regarding what was occurring in Italy at this moment. Prunas, the charge d'affaires of foreign affairs at the time, went so far as to suggest a systematic re-education of Italians in Egypt in order to suture the gap between past and present. These post-war years compounded to create an air of uncertainty for Italians. The Egyptian Company Law in 1947 set employment quotas which limited work opportunities for Italians and other foreigners. The Italian government and Italian residents questioned whether it would even be possible to transition from a community whose lifeline since the early 1930s was state-provided assistance to a, quote, employable community in an Egypt without the protections guaranteed by extraterritorial jurisdiction. Unemployment in these post-war years was between 18 and 25%, and when work was procured, it was often on a provisional basis. Many of Cairo's largest companies had dismissed Italian employees just before Italy's entry into the war. After the war, these same companies refused to rehire former employees, and this was made more difficult by the 1947 Company Law. Following the closure of the internment camps in late 1944, in the Canal Zone, the three cities Port Said, Ismailia, and Suez, over 90% of Italians were unemployed. Maurizio Basso, on a temporary diplomatic post in Port Said, warned, quote, it's possible that behind the difficulties confronting the Italians, there are concealed motives linked to the Egyptian authorities' desire to abolish the Montreux Convention, which had ended the capitulations, and then to be free to expel undesirables. He concluded, today, an unemployed foreigner is always an undesirable one. The war in Palestine brought another series of events to bear. The declaration of martial law and restrictions applied in May 1948, which were namely targeted towards Jews, but many Italian residents suspected that these were also part of a broader program of then Prime Minister Mahmoud Nokrashi to nationalize the Egyptian economy and dissolve any remaining extraterritorial privileges from which foreigners benefited. Italian residents were now required to renew residency permits every year instead of every 5 years previously. This change fueled already widespreading rumors about the possibility of expulsion of foreigners with the approaching end of the transition period in 1949. One angry resident in Alexandria penned a letter to the Italian president, writing, quote, "Reports, memorandums, articles in various journals, and so forth have all been written by authoritative people, but it all seems to finish in nothing. No one moves to meet the needs of the Italians in Egypt, who anxiously await your rescue," end quote. This tension between experience and expectation gives dimension to the temporal landscapes of decolonization. The Italian government observed that Italians in post-war Egypt did not dissociate themselves from the fallen fascist regime, but rather they detached themselves from the present, from the emerging geopolitical configuration in which they perceived the new Italian state and its actors as themselves having abandoned the Italians in Egypt to Italy's margins. Theirs was a past, however, that thanks to the long durée of extraterritorial jurisdiction in the Eastern Mediterranean, had positioned them, at least symbolically, at the center of Italy's imperial reach between Libya and Ethiopia. Uncertainty did not simply refer to a sentimental experience of Italian subjects at the micro scale of experience, but also characterized political actors' indecision in taking positions towards Italian residents, knowing that regional hierarchies of power were undergoing dramatic transformation. Discussions began, for example, in the spring of 1951 for a delegation of Egyptian military officers to study Italian military and political infrastructure. This advisory role was to play a key part in Italy's emerging Mediterranean vocation, its presumed ability to navigate the waters between Atlantic, European, and Middle Eastern political spheres. The free officers then seized power in July 1952 and quickly passed laws to settle residency issues. They increased the terms of residency for foreign residents, especially those whose economic and technical skills could benefit the faltering Egyptian economy. Rather than interpreting this, however, as a solution to the preoccupations of foreign communities, most Italian subjects saw new regulations as a political measure meant to contain the flight of foreign capital. For residents with no clear answers to long-term policies on residency, and amidst circulating rumors of expulsion, sudden attempts to resolve issues, wrote one resident, quote, "will not eliminate the sense of growing unease because it has deep roots and depends by now on the uncertainty of the political and economic future of the country," end quote. Meanwhile, the Italian government and the military officers colluded in organizing the expulsion of King Farouk. Given the refuge provided to the former Italian king in 1946, the Italian government agreed to host Farouk. Under careful surveillance, the exiled king was cautioned to respect, quote, "the obligations of hospitality and to not embarrass the Italian government," end quote. Italian politicians and Egyptian military leaders tightened their connections around this exchange. Following the January 1952 demonstrations that culminated in the destruction of symbols of European presence in Cairo, the Italian government agreed to furnish 2 large police squadrons to the Egyptian military. Out of these deals, the Egyptian regime arranged for further study of Italian political infrastructure, followed by investment in training and equipment from the Italian state. Many of this continues to this day. When the free officers declared martial law in 1953, the Italian Minister of Defense, Randolfo Pacciardi, set out to visit Mohammed Naguib in Egypt. He intended to solidify ties in a geopolitical configuration rhetorically unified around, quote, "the defense of the Mediterranean." It's important to note here that Pacciardi was a proponent of Italy's participation in NATO. This exchange marks the entry of the United States into regional affairs, into the Mediterranean. Aware that Italy and Egypt had this long history of exchange, the US government used this channel to covertly influence regional politics by putting, for example, high-level fascist propagandists on the payroll of the OSS, the precursor to the CIA, as early as 1949. The path was paved then for Italy to serve as a bridge between the Middle East and Europe. Italian residents and the history of migration that brought them to Egypt, however, surfaced merely as an index to a narrative of transnational kinship. Departures increased over these years. By 1951, an estimated 6,000 Italian residents and their families had left Egypt. Little changed until departures accelerated with the Suez conflict in the late autumn of 1956. Because Italy and Egypt were not in a state of political conflict, Italians arriving from Egypt during the Suez conflict did not qualify as, quote, refugees. They were classified rather as poor and thus received the same support as any recipient of state welfare. This, of course, did not account for the conditions of their displacement, a perceived inequity that was often a point of political contention. In February 1957, for example, when Eduardo Costa, in charge of foreign affairs for the neo-fascist Movimento Sociale Italiano, traveled to Egypt to meet with Nasser, he stirred a group of Italian residents against the Italian government, claiming that it revealed its disinterest in Italiani d'Egitto, the Italians of Egypt, by failing to acknowledge that repatriates were not simply impoverished Italians, but rather were victims of international political relations. Costa portrayed the absent welcoming of the Italian state as a repudiation of the historic role Italian immigrants had played in developing Italy's prestige on the edge of empire. His words echoed those of Italians in and from Egypt and rested on a notion of extraterritoriality that had engendered a political community. By early 1957, over 3,000 repatriated Italians had requested assistance from the state or its regional offices. In Livorno, the regional welfare office rented 4 private villas to house 237 individuals. Over the course of 1957, of these individuals, at least 89 left in search of work in other cities and abroad. Many went to Milan, where between August 1956 and February 1957, over 400 additional families requested assistance upon arrival. Parliament then voted to extend the definition of refugee according to a 1952 law to include Italians from Egypt, but it would take several years for the legal status to take effect, holding many in a state of limbo that reinforced the sense of statelessness observed after the Second World War. The Ministry of Work and Social Affairs worked with the newly established Intergovernmental Committee for European Migration to internationalize integration, relocating Italians from Egypt to Brazil, Australia, then Rhodesia, Argentina, and Uruguay. This cooperation was seen as one of the few answers to the economic and financial strain caused by repatriation. Both the political right and left, however, depicted the government's practice of sending Italians abroad through the Intergovernmental Committee as a failure of the Italian state itself. The financial strain caused by providing housing and welfare to the displaced put the state treasury on the verge of toppling the fragile national budget. By the summer of 1957, the situation in Livorno was at the breaking point. The local administration encouraged the welfare organization to push its refugees out. As elsewhere, many individuals lacked resources to facilitate travel, even when emigration had been approved. The Red Cross, which oversaw various refugee centers, had also nearly exhausted its funds. The organization's leadership advised that emigration of Italian repatriates from Egypt be expedited. And in the following months, around 350 families were sent to South America through the Intergovernmental Committee, while the organization pressured Australia to raise its quota to accommodate Italian immigrants from Egypt. The marginalization of repatriates from Egypt replicated the shared sense of isolation Italian residents in Egypt had experienced during the Second World War. As conditions deteriorated in refugee camps, small collectives formed, appealing to politicians to intervene on their behalf. One group in Genoa, a port of arrival from Egypt where many repatriates awaited future departures, formed the National Committee of Italians of Egypt. In making a case for their present and future, they looked towards their past in the imperial Mediterranean. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs immediately refused moral support or financial backing for this committee and warned regional state offices to do the same, fearing the constitution of analogous associations and committees representing marginalized communities that could constitute volatile political constituencies. But the committee in Genoa was not isolated. One group of repatriates had arrived in Messina, another port of arrival, and remained in the refugee center there for over 1 year. 89 members of this group petitioned local authorities to acknowledge, quote, the lack of possibilities to be absorbed in patria, end quote. They claimed they had been excluded from formal recognition as refugees and therefore deprived of entitlements that characterize the precise circumstances of their departures and of their long history of maintaining links to Italy through its extraterritorial national institutions in Egypt. They blamed the new Italian government for the hostility they faced in Egypt, arguing that the ambiguous position of the London conference during the Suez conflict and Italy's failure to clearly align with Egypt had, quote, assimilated Italian residents to other foreign communities in Egypt and obscured their unique history. Furthermore, this diplomacy, they argued, had constrained them to, quote, suddenly leave belongings, houses, positions, and interests in Egypt, end quote. Within 1 year, the group in Messina joined the committee in Genoa, which by then had established committees in Rome, Genoa, Milan, Livorno, Naples, Brindisi, and Messina. The committee claimed that by mid-1957, nearly half of the Italian community had left Egypt. Overcrowding in temporary refugee camps became common, and the concentration of repatriates in urban centers like Rome and Milan was discouraged by authorities. The government worked to redistribute groups into smaller camps in smaller provincial cities, hoping in the process to disrupt the organization of further organizations like the National Committee for Italians of Egypt. Italian American and Israeli Jewish associations encouraged Jewish families to emigrate to Israel. At least 11 of the 41 families in Livorno had in fact already left Italy for Israel by late 1957, a move that was viewed favorably by the Italian government. In a body camp in Puglia, where families were housed in one-room units without furniture, a group of 22 families organized. Local authorities had encouraged them to abandon the camp. But a group of authorities signed a collective petition in which they wrote how were they supposed to, quote, make a home in this new place without any resources or connections. The Italian ambassador at the time described the Italians of Egypt, now spread between Italy and Egypt, as suffering from, quote, chronic uncertainty. So in conclusion, in this narrative, decolonization does not appear as an event which separates before and after, nor one that neatly marks the trajectory towards territorialization. Instead, it represents the multiplication and layering of socio-historical processes across time. When Vittorio Emanuele III had arrived in Egypt in 1946, he had been welcomed by Farouk and by the community of Italian subjects. With the exile of King Farouk several years later and the end of extraterritorial jurisdiction, Italian residents in Egypt were twice without a king, stateless subjects caught between two emergent regimes. Unless they were to be denationalized, the result Gramsci had anticipated as a consequence of the end of extraterritoriality, they would have to leave Egypt. And indeed, by 1960, over 40,000 Italians did leave Egypt. The decision to leave involved negotiating multiple changing configurations of subjecthood. Their departures and relocations were a way of coming to terms with these histories. in attempting to understand the tension between experience and expectation that marked encounters between Italian subjects in Egypt and a variety of political actors around them. Today, I sought to demonstrate that the unraveling of the colonial Mediterranean was not simply a disentangling of various colonial communities, but rather a process or a series of processes that engendered or created political communities by drawing upon a repertoire of historical experiences that crossed both space and time. This approach to Italian departures from Egypt reveals temporal dynamics that are at play when individuals cross borders, carrying with them multiple and layered historical processes which take on new meanings and values within emerging geopolitical configurations. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Joseph. Um, as Gary put in the chat, please write your questions or you can ask to be unmuted if you want to ask any questions. Can I ask a question? Actually, I have two questions. One is very basic, very basic, and the other one I hope that I'm formulating in a comprehensible way. I wanted to ask you to give us a little bit of a background of how these Italians got here, because it wasn't. I mean, you talked about the capitulations. And I'm wondering if how old these communities were in Egypt, and because this would then suggest that there might have been, which is something that I think that you're saying, multiple Italian communities in Egypt who identify themselves in multiple ways at different times. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit, give a little bit of background of who these people were, when they got there, when they begin to be identified as such, etc. And then the other question that I wanted to ask was one that you started with this idea of expanding the temporal framework. So given my last question of you telling us when these people got here, how wide is your temporal framework, and how do you decide when and how to adjust it in order to be able to examine these communities? Is the temporal framework being determined by your subjects' historical references, the references that they themselves are making, or how do you make that calculation in this process of widening this theoretical framework or temporal framework? Thank you. If that makes sense to you.
Yeah, both of those make sense. On one hand, this is the problem of trying to talk about a community that no one really knows about, because you always have to say something about their origins, which I didn't do. And in some sense, I don't do that when I talk about the post-war, because I think that one of the interesting things about the post-war is how mythical that origin itself is. Now, the Italians of Egypt, as you said, yeah, they represent, it's a wide range of origins, and we could say Italian communities, from quote unquote Italians that came, that arrived with Napoleon's troops, to exiles from during the Risorgimento period, during the years of national unification in Italy. Those are kind of portrayed as the quote unquote origins of the community, but those numbers are actually very small. In fact, in the mid 19th century, there are some records that talk about kind of between 2,000 and 3,000 Italians living there. Now, it's not entirely clear how that's being defined in that moment, actually. Until 1864, there is not an Italian consulate. This is a couple years after national unification, when the consulates are all consolidated. And at that point, the numbers are in the around, I think, 15,000 or so. And by that point, then we have, we have political exiles from Risorgimento. There's a lot of Garibaldini who are there, Carbonari, especially after the more conservative Italian state takes hold right away with Cavour. You have a lot of the more radical Garibaldini who flee and create a kind of community in Alexandria. Now you also have what's been a subject of a lot of recent research into the late 19th century, a large radical culture, radical political cultures. You have anarchists, and as part of a kind of broader international network of Mediterranean anarchism, or of international anarchism, really, that's rooted in this city. And that's been, I think that's been kind of overemphasized as part of the cosmopolitan nature of Alexandria. Ilham Makdisi has written a really good book on this. But then really the bulk of the community comes during the period of Italian immigration, which overlaps with British occupation in 1882. So when we talk about the bulk of the Italian community, we're actually talking about what looks like a lot of other immigrant Italian communities, and it happens, which the kind of big, if we talk about the Great Migration in Italian history, it's from the late 1870s until the cusp of the First World War. And that is, in fact, when the most growth happens in the Italian community in Egypt. Now, that part of the story is often left out in the narrations of the community's history that really take shape during the fascist period, when the regime realizes that this large presence of Italians in Egypt serves as a kind of community through which they can subvert British hegemony in the Mediterranean. And their main way of doing that is not by directly attacking the British, but by feeding Egyptian nationalists and by really cohering this Italian community and creating a national community there. And all of this is enabled by the capitulations. Now, that's like the very short summary answer of the different communities. Now, in terms of the second question, which is if we expound the temporal analysis, how do we do that? I don't think it's, I don't think we have to go to the longue durée here. But I think what we do need to do is consider or reconsider the periodization through which we understand the modern Mediterranean, which often sees a kind of rupture happening in which things like the kinds of relations that are cultivated through capitular regimes are said to more or less stop functioning within communities. Now, I think Egypt is kind of an easy case there because they exist so late, but it doesn't quite work, as we know from scholarship on Tunisia, of which there's much more, I think. In fact, I see Gabriele Montalbano has just written a question there. He's one of the ones who's written widely on the Italians in Tunisia. So I think that embracing a temporal framework does not mean turning to a longue durée, but rather accepting that these processes have afterlives, which we need to factor in. And there are different things, I think, affecting that. One of them is that those of us working in modern and contemporary period tend to have this sense that, well, we have so many sources, we can rely on those sources. And then we just fall into a kind of narration of events as they occur, forgetting that there are processes still unfolding from prior periods and shaping those realizations. And I think for me, what really struck me, just to say a word about those sources, is that I fell into this project in a way that I hadn't really expected. And I read, for example, the entire diplomatic archives from 46 until 56 that was available to me. And one of the things that was fascinating to me in it was the amount of negotiation, and not negotiation in kind of diplomatic terms, but negotiation of of experience, of this sense that, well, this is what had been there before, and this is what these community members are dealing with, or these are the letters that I'm receiving, look at this, and how do we move from here? So there was this constant interplay with multiple temporalities that were shaping that present moment. And it was there where I thought, okay, so there's something really salient happening with temporality that says, let's not stick with strict periodization. Again, the strict periodization that I would really argue with is the post-war one, which sees a kind of decolonial rupture between the post-war world of decolonization and the emergence of nation states in North Africa, and the breakdown of Europe's imperial realm, and these kind of pre-war colonial worlds. I'll stop there.
Thank you.
Okay. So yeah, we have a question from Gabriela Montalbano there. I was wondering about solidarity between these particular Italians abroad. In the same years of the repatriation of Italians in Egypt, there was also a repatriation of Italians of Tunisia and Italy. Was there a connection between these two groups of Italians in Africa? What about the relation of the Greek communities of Egypt? There was a circulation of practices among these groups too?
These are both really great questions. I'll answer the easy part first, which is the Greeks in Egypt. And there's Angelos Dalakanis has written about the departure of Greeks in Egypt. Him and I have worked together a lot in trying to understand this moment. He's, I think, interestingly also really focused on the abolition or the ending of the capitulations as being a formative part of this history, of really understanding what's happening with these departures. They have very similar experiences. Of course, the Greek community was much larger, was the largest community of foreigners in Egypt, and the Italians were second to the Greeks. Now, during the Second World War and the fascist period, there was, say, quite a bit of animosity that develops between Greeks and Italians, particularly after the occupation of the Decolonising. And a lot of this plays out in the kind of the field of work and labor in post-war Egypt, when jobs were increasingly hard to come by, and a lot of post that Italian workers. So this is mostly a kind of working class community. The vast majority of Italians in Egypt were mechanics and carpenters and laborers. And of course, this is a narrative that a lot of Italians in Egypt themselves work against, because, and this will respond to the first part of that question, which is that the narrative that is inherited, particularly during the fascist period, is the narrative of Italians in Egypt being this formative national community that is composed of or constituted by a nationalist elite or an intellectual elite, and that becomes the inherited narrative. That's kind of what is played up in the propaganda during the interwar years. And what's fascinating is that during the years of repatriation, which, as Gabriele says, happens elsewhere as well. There are Italians coming from Tunisia, from Egypt. You have Italians from East Africa being repatriated a little bit later from Algeria, and they're all interacting in post-war Italy. Now, one of the things that was really fascinating was actually the lack of collaboration between, specifically between Italians of Egypt and the other Italian communities. So even the kind of, they used a racialized language, talking, for example, about Italians from Tunisia, saying that they were kind of like rough and barbaric. They were peasants, whereas the Italians from Egypt were these kind of urban, cultivated and cultured peoples, right? This is the narrative of cosmopolitan Egypt that we also know from popular works like Asiman's Out of Egypt, and that whole genre of nostalgic literature from the post-war years.
Okay. So more questions coming in. This is from Pedro Cantero. Uh, could you expand a little bit, maybe give an example on how your model of national identity based on a national minority living outside its national territory could help us to reconsider the experience of community formation of a more standard national community, which indeed lives in that territory?
Hmm. Um, well, I think what's key here, and this is again why I stress the temporal aspect of this as being, quite distinct from the experience of the Pied Noir, for example, in that there is a reliance on national narratives. I mean, the capitulations create a situation in which suddenly being outside is never quite outside, but you're always interacting with other communities and living in kind of plurilingual or multilingual or multicultural environments in which you're confronting others of various forms. And let's not forget that there's also a colonial hierarchy here, and there is a very clear racial divide between European communities and the Egyptian communities. One of the myths of the Italian community is that they were kind of the closest to the Egyptian community and somehow more anti-colonial than the rest. Now they were, this is true, but they were also, that a lot of that is due to fascist propaganda during the interwar years. So there's a kind of strange play of histories there. Now I think that complicated matrix is actually quite similar to what happens in migrant communities in different places. And I don't only mean transnational migration, but also the experience of movement between different places. I mean, I think that this complex interplay between different temporal extensions of experience, as well as the expectations, whether they're expectations to be received as kind of national heroes or representatives of the nation state abroad, or whether they're, an expectation of belonging coming from a rural community into an urban center within the same national kind of context. I mean, I think that these processes, I think it goes back to what I was saying in the beginning, which is the key to this analysis is not the containers, but rather the processual aspect to it. And it's there, I think, where we can actually learn quite a bit more about migration. And some of this is coming up as well in the recent, I think, or more recent critique of some of the tendencies of transnational studies. I mentioned Nancy Green's work. Laura Putnam also talks about this a bit in her analysis of some of the problems with the digitalization and digital access of materials, which is something that's been exacerbated in the last 9 months, I think. And I think also in the conversation between kind of micro and global history that we saw, for example, in the recent publication of Past and Present, this collective volume where we see the debates about microspatial histories and connected histories. I think that what I'm saying is not necessarily unique, but I think it's something that modernist and contemporary historians in particular have been quite hesitant to incorporate in their analysis.
Okay. Also, another short question here from NAD Iorio. Can you talk about Italian communities during the Nasser period of Egypt?
So during the Nasser period is from 54 until I have until the late 60s, I guess. I would kind of say that the Italian community, as I'm using it in this way in this talk, less so in my book and in the broader work. And I mean, there's a key difference there in that I'm incorporating a lot of material from the present also in that work. But I would say that it's during Nasser's period that this aspect of the community, the kind of physical or material community itself, ends in Egypt. Now, that's not fair, and there are lots of people who would argue against that, particularly Italians that are living in Egypt today, but there are only about 200, probably less now, Italians that actually trace origins in one way or another to the community that I spoke about today. I think there are 5,000 Italians currently residing in Egypt, but many of them arrived in the last 20 or 30 years. During the Nasser period, what happened was, at first the departures after the Second World War were young working-aged people, young couples, young men who left their families basically in Egypt and would go to work either in Italy or South America or somewhere else. And then what happened over the course of the 1950s was that the rest of the families followed them, established bases in different places, and as I mentioned, you had this overflowing of refugee camps, and there was an obligation at the time to report to one's paesi di origine, one's town of origin, in order to receive assistance or aid, which meant for many people, after 2 or 3 generations, going back to a town with which they had no connection, really. So during the Nasser period, we really see the dissolution of the community and its physical presence in Egypt. I mean, I think that the final kind of moment of the community is a series of nationalizations that happened between 1961 and 63, which really preclude any kinds of big business endeavors that are not channeled through diplomatic means. Now, I say that also having written on the turn that happens, and having spoken about the turn that happens in Nasser's period, in that the new kind of geopolitical framework means that there's a greater Italian and Egyptian diplomatic partnership that comes out of this moment, so that we also have the establishment of the Italian oil company in Egypt, in I think starting in 1954. In fact, during the Suez Crisis, the Italian government begs Enrico Mattei, the oil tycoon, to remain in Egypt, because they're worried that if he leaves Egypt in the midst of the crisis, in the midst of the conflict, that the Egyptian government might question Italy's commitment to the nationalization of the Suez Canal and to its broader kind of project of national sovereignty. So the community itself leaves during these years, but it's really during Nasser's reign in which it becomes about a different kind of geopolitical formation.
Okay, I think we have somebody who wants to ask a question directly. This is Professor Leila Amzi Erdoğan, and here at Rutgers, Newark. So I'll let her go ahead and just directly ask her question.
Sure. Thank you, Gary. Thank you, Joseph. This was great, and I think a lot of that I wanted to ask was you already answered. But what I'm wondering is, was there or could one talk about sort of layered identities among the Italian community there? So were there people who sort of saw themselves as Egyptian and Italian in a way, and you already talked about the prospects of the community in independent Egypt and so on, but was there any kind of organized attempt at sort of remaining in Egypt, or sort of proposing this kind of sort of multi-layered identity among the call, or were they just seen, from the 30s on as just another European colonial community, considering that they were in Libya and Eritrea and all this, just sort of bordering Egypt? Mm-hmm. So that's it.
Thank you. So I mean, in terms of an organized way of kind of trying to remain in Egypt, I mean, there were, the Egyptian government actually had several laws that through which Italians could have chosen to adopt Egyptian nationality. In fact, there was I think it was 1948 when there was a major law that was introduced, and of all of the foreign communities, only 500 or so people actually went through with this. Now, Italian residents only until up until the 1990s could not have dual citizenship. So adoption of Egyptian nationality would have automatically meant losing their Italian citizenship. And that's, I think, relates in part to Gramsci's claim about the denationalization with the end of extraterritoriality, that these Italians would lose their status as Italians effectively. And then in terms of these more complicated, multi-layered identities, I mean, we don't, I mentioned Anthony Gorman's work, for example, and he adopts this phrase Egyptian Italian. Now, the Italian phrase for the community is, and I say phrase because it's not just a hyphenated identity category or something, but it's Italiani d'Egitto, and it's the Italians of Egypt, or the Italians from Egypt, depending on who or how it's translated. And I think that that's really key, because it's never there's never this perception of them being Egyptian or being Egyptianized, not so much. Being Italians who have a particular experience of Egypt or in Egypt, yes, and that's something that is very strong. But that develops after the Second World War, that aspect of the identity. If you look at all of the material up until really the late 1940s, letters, I mean, really, I've tried, in fact, and this is something that I'm always pushed on, and I've really tried to prove myself wrong about it. But no matter where I dig into different kinds of archives, and looking at questions sideways and trying to find some version of this kind of plurinational identity, I just don't find it. And I think it's also very similar with the emergence of anti-fascism, is that you just don't see it there. And when it does happen in 1943, it happens very late, and it's largely rejected by the community. So I think that this overlapping of nationalism in the immigrant context is actually something very important, that for, say, the last 30 years or so of research on migration, we've been hesitant to accept it as a possibility, and I think it would do some good for us to think about the prospects of there being these kinds of very strong national formations that are not neatly cosmopolitan or hyphenated necessarily. I don't know if that makes very much sense, but.
Okay. So go ahead,
yes,
Maite.
thank you so much, Joseph, for this very, very rich talk, and for ending this semester of the Mediterranean Displacement lecture series. We've ended, I think, in a very high note. And I am hoping that all of you have enjoyed this series of 3 talks this semester. I would like to end this by saying that next semester we will continue the Mediterranean Displacements Project lecture series. You can visit us, you can visit our website at sites.rutgers.edu/MDP/. We will have this lecture posted, as well as the previous lectures posted on our site. You can also visit our Facebook page, follow us on Twitter, and we have a YouTube channel where we have all of the lectures posted. And again, thank you very much, Joseph, for this wonderful talk, and hope to see you all next semester.
Thank you all.